Do you think work can change the world? Do you have a little rebel in you? If you said yes, this is your podcast. You don't have to settle for bad management, bad leadership, and bad workplaces. There are better ways. Let's find them together. I'm your host, Stash D. Walsh, and this is Insubordinate. Better workplaces, better world. Welcome back to the program. I am frustrated this morning because I've just, like most of the rest of the world, finished watching the Women's World Cup. It was a great tournament, some really fantastic individual and team displays. I'm a soccer idiot. For those of you who don't know me outside of this podcast, I watch soccer pretty religiously and have for 35 years. I was excited about this tournament and I watched almost every game, but I am frustrated this morning because of the headlines that have dominated in the post-World Cup media, mostly those surrounding Spain, who won the tournament by defeating England. And in the aftermath of that, there was an incident between one of Spain's star players, Jenni Hermoso, and the president of the Spanish FA, Spanish Football Association, Luis Rubiales, in which, during their exchange, Luis Rubiales kissed her on the lips. For those of you who are not familiar, in soccer, what happens after a big tournament like this, when someone wins the tournament, every single player is paraded up in front of a handful of dignitaries, usually the president of the association, FIFA, the presidents of the two countries' organizations, as well as whoever the other VIPs are from the host country, that sort of thing. So they all go up, they shake a bunch of hands, they give a bunch of hugs. A lot of kisses on both cheeks are exchanged because obviously in the United States that's not normal, but in a lot of the rest of the world it is. And then someone puts a medal around each participant's neck, and then they go off to a stage and finally they're awarded the trophy. What happened in this case was, once they got to the president of the Spanish FA, he was criticized in the aftermath of the tournament for being a little enthusiastic in his greetings of the players, and maybe some of that is understandable given they just won the World Cup and all of the emotion that goes along with that. But that can't be an excuse. And if you're going to kiss someone on the lips who in essence is a coworker, Luis Rubiales is the person who gets to decide who is the coach of the national team. And the coach of the national team is the boss of these players, if this was an organizational structure. So you're talking about your boss's boss is going to kiss you on the lips because you were part of some amazing achievement. Totally inappropriate. If you can explain what happened, it still doesn't make it right. Luis Rubiales did this, and so I'm frustrated this morning because the backdrop of a major international tournament is filled with all of these, people will call them controversies. For me, they're not controversies. They're problems. So we start talking about pay for men's national teams versus women's national teams, which is obviously big news in the United States in the sporting world because our women's national team has won the World Cup 4 times. They were bidding for a third consecutive World Cup victory. No one has ever done that, men or women. The Brazil men's national team is the record holder. They've only won it one more time than our women have. So our women are amazing. And they had to go to court to fight to get equal pay. So there's part of that backdrop. There are other teams. Jamaica, for example, had to fundraise to get to go to the World Cup. The Nigerian women complained about how they had not been paid by their association. There was all these problems. Again, I'm not going to call them controversies because for me, they're not this is not controversial. This is about fairness, about people being paid right, about getting their checks on time, about not having to fundraise to go to an international tournament. Those problems existed in the backdrop of this. And among other things, of course. But the one that I want to focus on is the pay equality aspect of this, and the fact that when women are treated a certain way, I don't understand why we don't believe them when they say things. I don't understand why we don't believe women when they say things. When women say that they're treated differently in the workplace, or when they don't like something, it's like we don't believe them, or we don't have time for that or something. It's just this bizarre phenomenon to me. I want to talk about that, and I want to go back to the World Cup as a backdrop for which to talk about that. So Spain wins the World Cup. There's this controversy problem again with Luis Rubiales and Jenni Hermoso. And the backstory even to all of that was that 15 players who were regularly part of the Spanish national setup refused to play for their coach, Jorge Vilda. They said that basically they were saying that he was not preparing them adequately for games, and also saying that their emotional health suffered under his leadership because they would do things like, if they were traveling to a game, for example, and the players decided to go out and they would come back with having bought something, for example, then their bags would be subject to search. And they told the players that the hotel rooms needed to remain unlocked until midnight so that they would be open for inspection, and things of this nature. There's problems going into the World Cup for Spain, well-documented problems, and very high-profile players who refuse to play for the national team as a result of these issues. Then Spain goes through the World Cup, plays a great tournament, wins the tournament, and then this thing happens between Jenni Hermoso and Luis Rubiales. The Spanish FA, their initial reaction when these 15 people decided that they weren't going to play for the national team until some of these things were addressed, their initial reaction was, I'm quoting this, their initial reaction was, "The footballers who have submitted their resignation will only return to the discipline of the national team in the future if they accept their mistake and ask for forgiveness." I can hardly think of a more patronizing way to say that. It's one thing if we're talking about a misunderstanding. It's another thing if we're talking about something that needs to be mediated. This is an accusation. This is allegations of abuse in what amounts to their workplace. And think about it, because I do this for a living and because I do this with all my time, it's easy for me to place myself in a spot where I'm thinking about this as, what would happen if this was in a corporation? What would happen if this was in a physical building with a boss or a boss's boss? So I'm asking you to put yourself in that mindset for just a moment, because I think it's absolutely crazy what the Spanish FA has been doing and the way that they've been talking about this. Because if they did that in any other workplace, I would like to think that there would be some sort of consequence for that. Although I know better than to think that it would be the kind of consequence that most of us would hope for, or that we would see as equitable or fair or just. So the Spanish FA says basically, you're not coming back to the national team unless you accept your mistake and ask for forgiveness. That sounds parental to me. That sounds condescending. That sounds really, really in poor taste in terms of a statement that they would make. Even if they wholeheartedly deny the charges, even if they say, we will conduct an investigation or whatever, it's a really dismissive way to go about it. So that was the backstory of Spain even going into the tournament. And then they win the tournament, and then this thing happens between Jenni Hermoso and Luis Rubiales. And some of you have already heard enough. Some of you have already heard enough, and you've said, this is too much for me. This is not fair. This is not right. This is not just. I don't get it. This is bad. I agree. Unfortunately, it gets worse. Naturally, in a day and age where social media makes world news instant, Spain wins the World Cup. They're in the locker room after the game, and players are recording on their phones and live streaming, and Jenni Hermoso is captured on camera saying that she didn't like it, that Luis Rubiales kissed her. And not long after that, Rubiales comes into the locker room as they're celebrating and promises the team a holiday in Ibiza. And then as soon as the cheering dies down from the players, he jokes in front of the entire room that during that holiday, they're going to celebrate the wedding of Jenni and Luis Rubiales. When I saw that video, I was absolutely flabbergasted. I'm thinking, okay, here's a guy who's willing to double down on the fact that he's done something that probably he should have immediately apologized for. Instead, he's joking that they're going to get married now and that all of the players are going to attend their wedding on this holiday that they're going to celebrate having won the World Cup. Jenni Hermoso is obviously in a very uncomfortable position, and it should surprise no one that her statement after the fact was, in my opinion, informed or advised, because it read, and again I'm quoting, "It was a mutual gesture that was totally spontaneous, prompted by the huge joy of winning a World Cup. The president and I have a great relationship. His behavior with all of us has always been 10 out of 10, and this was a natural gesture of affection and gratitude." And when a radio station asked her about it again later after the statement, she said, "I wish they had created controversy involving someone else. I'm a world champion, and that's what matters." In some ways, I get it, because this probably isn't the first time this has ever happened to her. If she's like most women, she's had to endure this kind of sexism and these kinds of unwanted gestures or physical contacts throughout her life. And so it doesn't surprise me in the least that she would want to minimize it in a way that says, I want to be able to celebrate having won the World Cup. And Jenni Hermoso is one of their best players. So it would be like the U.S. equivalent of Alex Morgan or Megan Rapinoe or somebody like that. She's a superstar. And she's played at a bunch of big clubs and all of these things. So she's a well-known player. And sure, she wants to be left alone. And I'm hypothesizing here. I understand that. But I think if that's been the pattern of your life and you grow up in an environment where professionally you have to put up with those things, and you know that whether you complain about it or not, there's not going to be much of a response to bringing these kinds of things up because they're not quote unquote criminal. And that's how people justify them and rationalize them, that we're not talking about the U.S. women's gymnastics scandal, for example. But again, my point is not that Luis Rubiales should be going to prison for something like this. It's that it's still wrong. It's still putting someone in an extremely uncomfortable position. It's still centralizing yourself in a moment where someone else should be taking the spotlight. Someone else should be enjoying what inarguably is the crowning moment of their professional career. And so do I have anything against what Jenni Hermoso is doing here? No, I don't. Because she wants to celebrate the crowning achievement of her professional career in a way that doesn't centralize Luis Rubiales. She wants to be able to celebrate with her teammates having won the World Cup. Here's what's interesting after that. Luis Rubiales, after the issue is surfaced, after everyone gets hold of this, his response, his quote was, again, I'm quoting, "The kiss with Jenni, there are idiots everywhere. When two people have a moment of affection that means nothing more, you can't listen to idiocy. We are the champions. That's it." Again, there are a million things wrong with this statement. First things first, take away all of the rationalization, take away all the explanation. What this boils down to is Luis Rubiales saying, I couldn't control myself. I couldn't control myself. He's saying when two people have a moment of affection because we are the champions, first things first, I'm not sure two people were having this moment of affection. I think one person was having this moment of affection, and the other one was just a drafted in, unwilling participant in it. But he's basically saying, I couldn't control myself. I was overcome with emotion that we'd won the World Cup, and so therefore I started doing things that were inappropriate. Sorry, but that's not an excuse. That's not good enough. I don't understand how we can say, because there are people saying, this is what happens. We win the World Cup. We're wrapped up in emotion. I don't think we should be making that much of a big deal about it. Blah, 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 blah. I don't subscribe to that point of view. I think it's absolutely crazy that we allow for terrible behavior and then rationalize it because there was some emotion involved. If something's not okay to do if there's no emotion involved, then why would it be okay to do if emotions are heightened? Just because we won doesn't mean it's okay for you to go around kissing people, man. Just because we won doesn't mean that you get to display that in a way that's not appropriate for a workplace. And then he's doubling down on it and acting like everybody who doesn't see it the way he sees it are idiots. Well, Jenni Hermoso in the moments after the match was the one saying on video that she didn't like it. Was she an idiot too? It's totally unacceptable. And again, the power distance between these two people is massive. This guy's president of their football association. He's a person who wields immense power. Jenni Hermoso is a player. She's very popular. She's excellent. But she doesn't have anything like the power that Luis Rubiales has. Nothing close. He's ready to just dismiss it out of hand and act like everybody who would question it is a total idiot. Meanwhile, she's just left to think, okay, how am I going to deal with this? And her initial moments of disappointment and dislike get swept away because not only is she having to share the spotlight of the biggest moment of her career, but then the guy shows up in the locker room and starts joking about it while they're still celebrating having won the World Cup. Everything about this is inappropriate. Everything. Naturally, in Spain, there's an immediate argument. There's an immediate divide about whether or not what he did was appropriate, about all of the things. And so several politicians are weighing in and saying, this is not appropriate, this is not okay. They have a gender equality minister in Spain, and her statement was very strongly against this and also generalized beyond that to say that this is a kind of sexual violence that women suffer regularly, and that this behavior on the part of Luis Rubiales just made that visible, that normally it's invisible. Now we've made it visible, and we can't stand by and normalize it. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what she said. And there's other people who are questioning if he's willing to do something like that in public in front of millions and millions of people on television cameras, then what might he be willing to do privately? That's an argument I have a little bit of a difficult time with, because that's the slippery slope argument. It might very well be true, but that is an assumptive argument. And at the same time, I don't think it's fair to assume that he's doing something in private just because he's displayed it in public. It might be a natural assumption. It might also be correct, but I don't think we can make that assumption, to be fair. Having said that, again, I think it's reasonable to start questioning that behavior based on what you observed. And I think it's also fair to call it aggressive. Now, some people are going to get all bent out of shape about that word, and they're going to want to reserve the use of the word aggression for things like physical violence. But again, I think if women are saying things, then we need to believe them. If they're saying things like, that made me uncomfortable, if they're saying things like, I didn't think that was right, or I didn't think that was fair, or I didn't want that, I don't understand why we're not believing them. So it won't surprise you to learn that the Spanish Football Association doubled down on their support of Jorge Vilda, the coach, and tweeted out right after the World Cup about, there was a trending tag about Vilda out because of the 15 players who had voiced their disappointment and opposition and refused to play for the national team based on some of the things they were experiencing under his leadership. And so the Spanish FA tweeted Bilda in after they won. And again, you can't even enjoy, if you're a current player, you can't even enjoy the fact that you've won. Now it's about somebody else. It's about the coach. And it's about how he did things. And it's about the Spanish FA wanting to dig one more in and come out on top. And Rubiales, of course, did the same thing. His description after the World Cup was that the people who want to complain and the people who are frustrated all the time, that basically they need to let that be a lesson to them and let other people get to work. That was his quote after the Spanish team won the World Cup. Again, just one more dig at the people who are raising these concerns, shedding light on these problems. And you've heard the term maybe sports washing, where nations who have questionable human rights records have been hosting events. There's a big controversy about the Men's World Cup being hosted by Qatar for this reason, and the labor force that was being utilized to construct the stadiums that were going to be played in, just to name one example. And this is a kind of that. It's a winning washing. And I don't know if there's an official term for that or not, but that's basically what it is. If Spain wins the World Cup, then the end justifies the means. And people will keep getting to do what they want to do. And the system, the structure, the organization is going to continue to support the people in spite of the fact that they have been called out by not just one or two people, but in this case, 15. And instead of doing what was right at the time and either suspending Jorge Vilda or firing him altogether, they backed him to the end, kept letting him do what he was going to do. Now, to be fair, there have been reports that there aren't as many of those things like room inspections and that sort of thing, that he's backed off of that some. But there's also been consistent reports about how the team doesn't really celebrate with him when they score a goal or when they win. So there's clearly a divide there still. And it's not like there's any shortage of people who would be lining up to be the head coach of the Spanish women's national team. That's one of the best jobs in world football. It's winning washing. It's just saying, well, we win, and so whatever happens, happens, and we're okay with it. And those players who decided that they weren't going to play for the national team, they're definitely going to be on the outside looking in now because the team won without them. And despite the fact that some of the best players in the world are among them, their voices are now going to be minimized. Their complaints are not going to be heard because Spain won anyway. Let me transition this for a little bit into the workplace and thinking about pay and equality in the workplace. And I use that term very broadly. I think about it in terms of the way people are treated. I think about it in terms of advancement opportunities. I think about it in terms of remuneration. I think about it in terms of representation. So there's a lot there. And we could talk about all of those as different topics on separate podcasts. I know I'm lumping a lot in with this. I was doing some research about this, and I've always kept my finger on the pulse of this, but the most recent numbers I could get were from a 2022 Pew Research study, which said that women make 82 cents for every dollar a man makes in the United States. So there's still a pretty significant disparity between men and women in terms of remuneration. It's better for women who are 25 to 34 because they make 92 cents for every dollar a man makes. But let me be very careful about how they frame that, because That's still not 100 cents for every dollar a man makes, which means it's not acceptable. And there are a lot of reasons people posit for the disparity between genders in terms of pay. And I want to dig into that a little bit also, because men and women tend to differ on what they think the reasons are. For example, the one that's the biggest difference is women are much more likely than men to say that a major reason for the gap in pay is that employers treat women differently. 61% of women say that employers treat women differently, and that's one of the reasons why pay inequity persists. Only 37% of men say that. That's a 24% gap, which is substantial. Again, my question continues to be, when women say things, why don't we believe them? If women say that they're treated differently in the workplace, our response should be, how? How is that happening? Because if we know how it's happening, then we have the information that we need to remedy it. And that should be our only response. That should be our only recourse. It shouldn't be, well, it's because of this or it's because of that, or I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do about that, or whatever other excuses we're making. So back to soccer for a second. It's the exact same thing. Gianni Infantino, who is the president of FIFA, the international organization that governs soccer, he had a really strange press conference during the World Cup, because obviously the backdrop of this is, as I said before, Nigerian women not being paid by their association, the Jamaican women being massively underfunded, the United States women having to go to court for equal pay in the recent past, etc. So Infantino is holding this press conference and he's talking about this, and he says, I'm quoting again, "I say to all the women that you have the power to change. Pick the right battles. Pick the right fights. You have the power to change. You have the power to convince us men what we have to do and what we don't have to do. You do it. Just do it. With men, with FIFA, you will find open doors. Just push the doors. They are open. And do it also at a national level, in every country, at continental level, in every confederation. Just keep pushing. Keep the momentum. Keep dreaming. And let's really go for a full equality." How's that for a mixed message? On the one hand, I hear him trying to encourage equality. But on the other hand, he's putting all the responsibility on women to push open the doors and fight and bring things up and tell men what they need to do and what they don't do. Or he used the word convince. Even inherent in that statement, there's at least an implicit acknowledgement that you're going to be pushing on doors that are locked, that are barred closed, that are someone's on the other side pushing against you. It's mind-boggling to me. I don't understand how, if someone says we're not being treated equally, we're not being treated fairly, these things are happening. I don't understand why, as men, if we're in power, we're saying things like, push on the door and you'll find it open. Like, why don't I just open it from the inside? Why don't I just say, hey, you know what? Now that you've knocked on the door and I've heard it, I'll just open it because it lies within my power to do so. And why don't I invite you in and have you have a seat at the table next to mine so that as we're making decisions going forward, your voice matters and you are an equal partner in this, and we hear the perspective and value the perspective and make changes or decisions based in part on your perspective. We're not listening. It's crazy to me. And soccer is a visible example of that because, again, it's the World Cup. It only happens once every 4 years. It's a massive stage. The television audience for World Cup is way more than the Super Bowl. That's the kind of scale we're talking about here. But if you take that down, and again, I've used this phrase before because it's one of the slogans of my business. Individuals are the cornerstones of organizations. Organizations are the cornerstones of communities. Communities are the cornerstones of the world. So we're talking about the World Cup. We're talking about nations. but we're also talking about what happens to individuals in their places of employment, in their organizations. Because bottom line, if you do the same job, if a man and a woman do the same job, they should be paid the same. Period. The only reason why that shouldn't be true is if you have some sort of pay for performance model based on an objective criteria. Now, some of you are going to bristle a little bit when I say that, but let me give you an example. I mentioned earlier in this podcast, the Women's World Cup team, the U.S. Women's National Team, has won the World Cup 4 times. Our men's team has never come close to winning the World Cup. And I'm not saying that to disrespect them. I love the men's national team, and I watch them every chance I get. They've never won the World Cup. They've not been close. So in terms of performance, if we're paying people for performance, then our women's national team should have been being paid more than our men's national team all along. Instead, they were making less, and they had to go to court to get equal pay. So what's up with that? Because if we're going to talk about paying for performance, then the performance should be objective criteria. And in a sport, that is how far you get in a world tournament, how far you get at the World Cup, whether or not you win your local regional governing body. In the U.S., it's called CONCACAF, whether you win that tournament or whether you qualify for the World Cup, because it hasn't been in the too distant past that the U.S. men's national team failed to qualify for the World Cup. If you have the same job, you should have the same pay, period. And women should not have to put up with an environment where they have to share the stage during one of the most important moments of their career. They shouldn't have to think about anything other than, I just won the World Cup, or I just accomplished a major milestone, or I just got promoted, or I just finished a project that I'm proud of, or whatever it is. That should not have to include any thinking whatsoever about how a man is going to respond to that, or what a man is going to do in that environment that might cause this person to feel discomfort, or to feel like they need to justify, or feel like they need to share that moment in any way that they don't elect to do themselves. And that, bottom line, is why I have a big problem with Luis Rubiales. That's why I have a problem with what happened with Jenni Hermoso, because she didn't ask for that. She didn't initiate that. She is put in the center of a problem now because she happens to be a player who won the World Cup, and someone else happens to respond in a way that was totally inappropriate. And now she's got to deal with it. Because even though Luis Rubiales has lots more power than Jenni Hermoso has, she is a lot more famous than Luis Rubiales. More people know who Jenni Hermoso is than know who Luis Rubiales is. And so all of the responsibility lands on her shoulders to make a statement, to figure it out, to live with it, or to learn how to live with it, or decide how it's going to go down. All because of something that she had no agency in, no choice in to begin with. And I want to take a moment here to say, I know this topic is broader than just what we're talking about today. I know this topic is broad enough that it includes transgender people. I know that it is broad enough to include people who are marginalized or discriminated against in other ways, be that because of orientation or because of race and ethnicity. Again, those inequities are real. They exist. I acknowledge them. I think organizations, communities, the world can and should be doing better in all of those places. I know I'm focusing on just this one for today. So if you're listening to this and you're saying, yes, and also these, and also these, and also this, and that's not even the half of it. Yes, you are right. Sadly, unfortunately, though I wish it were different, you are right. This is just the latest in a long line of very public incidents that illustrate a massive problem. So I'm going to ask that question one more time. When women say things, and you could fill the blank in where women is for a lot of different kinds of people. When those underrepresented or marginalized or minority individuals say things, why don't we believe them? I think we should believe them. I think we should ask, how is this happening? And I think our only response has to be, let's make this better. Let's make this just. Let's make this equitable. Let's make this fair. I know I usually sign off with the hope that you have taken something away from this podcast that's practical and valuable for you. Honestly, I don't know if that's been the case this particular time. I'm not making any prescriptions other than if you are a person who gets to make decisions in an organization or in any sphere of influence you have, use that power to make it so that people have equitable treatment. And I know I usually sign off with saying, in the meantime, stay with the program. But I'm going to finish this podcast a little differently because there are some people who need to hear a different message today. And that is, we've been waiting for you to get with the program. Insubordinate episodes release weekly on Tuesday mornings. If you found this episode helpful, please consider rating or writing a review for the podcast or sharing it with a friend. As always, resources to help you are listed in the program notes. Until next time, stay with the program.